all of a sudden I woke up and I was under the truck. And then I felt something rocking heavy, and it rocked on my right arm, on my elbow, and I passed out again.
Hello, my name is Jeffrey, and welcome to the very first What We Learn podcast. Over the years, I've run across people with amazing life stories. Every time I hear one of these stories, I tell them, you should write a book. They usually chuckle and say, maybe someday. But more often than not, someday never comes, and those stories are lost forever. I ask myself all the time, why am I here? Why are any of us here? And what got me to this point in time? One small moment in time can change everything, and in my history alone, I've dodged several bullets, figuratively and literally. For our very first podcast episode, we're interviewing my Grandpa John. These stories are about ordinary people, but sometimes the stories themselves aren't so ordinary. So without further delay, I'll have my brother Aaron take it from here for the very first episode of the What We Learn podcast.
Yeah. For hours in the same spot in the woods. And people say, what are you doing? Oh, man, I'm just watching things. And you'd see a bird in a tree, and you'd watch it. And maybe it would chirp for a while, and you'd listen to it, and you'd listen to its combination of chirps. And then all of a sudden, some little noise. Sometimes I'd pick up something and flick it off a little bit, and it would land. And, you know, the bird would take notice. And then I watched, was this a big fear factor for it? But, you know, I was finding out a very curious thing, that animals don't show as much fear as I believe a lot of human beings do, unless they have learned to be afraid about something. And if you watched him, it was kind of interesting to see that take place as a kid. So I can understand Dick's concept.
I suppose that's kind of like when you go into like an animal reserve, the animals tend to be a lot more docile and you can get close to them.
Yeah, because they don't have...
They're used to humans.
In that area, they're used to that, and they're used to that area. And by the way, sometimes people get the idea that those same animals will go somewhere else. And
Yellowstone is a perfect
they'll keep
example.
doing the same thing.
Yeah.
But that isn't true from what I've seen.
So they can change.
Huh?
So they can change.
They can think.
Yeah.
And they organize their thoughts. Not like we, but they organize their thoughts. It's very obvious they do.
Yeah.
So...
Well, when you were talking about being in the woods, it was reminding me of a conversation that we had, I don't know, when I was here a couple times ago, and I think you brought up the fact of perseverance and keeping people motivated. I think maybe we were talking about employees, and you were talking about when we were young, growing up, we would go out into the woods and we would start these little projects, right? Like building a log cabin. I remember trying to build a log cabin out behind your house, and we'd be at it for a few hours, and then we would start to fall off the wagon. We'd start to give up, and then you would show up, and all of a sudden it was like we were on board again. We were going to build this log cabin, right? Yeah.
Watching the enthusiasm change. And, well, I could see you being, we're tired, I'm not sure. Yeah, but what if we do this? Let's get that log over there or whatever. And, I do remember that log thing. I always kind of wish it got up higher, but then changing it after we got started, because you say, well, that's not going to be right because the door will be in the wrong place. But the enthusiasm, as things would get poured on in a hurry. And even though it was bothering my health some, I would love to see you guys, get all on fire about it and all of it excited. Hey, we can get this much done today if let's just get with it. You guys could soup it up.
Well, I always felt bad that we didn't finish it either, but it was a life lesson, right?
Oh, yeah.
The log cabin was a life lesson.
Yeah.
Just like so many things that happened out here in the woods, right? Like building trails, building forts. There was a whole lot of life lessons that we were learning that at the time we didn't realize that they were life lessons. We just thought that we were having a good time, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, even you guys would have a real great habit of, in a lot of ways, I'm better in some ways than I was when I first got up here, and then I went through a better time, and now it's going back in the reverse area. But anyway, you come over to help. Oh, we're going to help you get wood into the woodshed, or vice versa, up to the house or whatever it is. And you say, well, and I'd been not feeling well, so I'd go in, and you'd be out there, and I'd look, and I'd say, oh, they're really dragging. They made the promise.
Yeah.
Now that's a life thing. They made the promise, and yet you guys were getting, enthusiasm was going away, and the excitement, and it was so fun to watch. I'd come out, and they'd see me, you'd see me, and then you'd turn around, and I'd say, well, let's do this and just do this, and I'd just pour that on like crazy, just getting in the wheelbarrow or however we were doing it, as we did with sleds and everything, and so watch it and all the excitement. Wow, we're going to have the porch full in a little bit here, and we can get this done. Totally change, right back to where you started, or even beyond that.
Yeah.
And, hey, I think it's a business thing, Jeffrey.
Yeah.
That's why you get these business ideas.
So when I may have been, 3-4 years old when you guys moved up here onto the mountain?
Probably so. Grandma's the one that remembers dates.
I have vague memories of you guys coming in and the trailer being moved up here. And you guys moved out of the farmhouse, right? And straight up here from the farmhouse?
Yeah,
in
straight
Fairfield?
up here, but it took a year to move.
Really?
Yeah, a lot of stuff. We just stayed down there and kept the old house. And, you didn't have to worry. Basically, we kept heat on in the place, but it didn't have to be very high. But it was water fed there, had gravity fed water to the house. And so, you could lose electricity for a while, but hey, it's the way life is.
What brought you to the conclusion to leave the farmhouse and come up here?
My health.
Okay.
Yeah, it was kind of the end of things. I knew I couldn't walk out of there in the winters. We had a area a big cut that when you come down there, come down the driveway, and you get an 8-9 foot drift in there, and it would start building up higher, and it was like solid. It felt solid. You'd walk on it. It was great, but you didn't dare drive into it. You'd bury yourself. And even guys tried to bring a cat in from the upper side. And that was the worst mistake in the world. They had to leave it there all winter. They couldn't get it any further. And yet it was sitting on rock. They couldn't move it. It just slid. It was too heavy. And so we'd wait for summer and then blow it out and shovel it out. And it was quite a job. But, it was a good thing all those years of being down there. I had to walk out, and the wind would blow so hard out there. That's why there would not be a drop of snow in the fields, and it would fill the cut in. Now, it would be great. You could drive on the fields, but only when they hadn't plowed. Because when they plowed, then you had these great big boulders because it would freeze hard as rock, and you couldn't drive on them. But otherwise, we could drive in the field and come right down close to the house and then just walk in from there. But otherwise, you'd have to go up there, and actually, literally, if we would have stopped bending over into the wind, carrying stuff up to the car, because I'd have to leave a week at a time. And if we were in a bent condition, you would have fallen flat on your face. And it was unbelievable how much that wind was. But with my heart condition, it got to the point that I couldn't. She was trying to Grandma was dragging everything out on a sled, and I was lucky to get myself up there. And so we knew that we had to, and your mom and dad said, you better come up here. We need to work out something.
That was a pretty long driveway, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, I can't remember, it was a third of a mile or something like that. And we got to get Jeffrey involved in this, too.
Yeah, we have to get Jeffrey involved in this.
If I remember right, there was a young man called Jeffrey that was at the house, came down to the farmhouse, and I actually cut in on his dad over a thing, which I didn't mean to do that, but he brought his bicycle down.
This is Jeffrey?
This is Jeffrey.
Okay.
And we had a nice little hill that went down, and I said, well, let's get on that and see what you can do. And he couldn't ride it. And, if we got on the hill, I just stayed behind him. I had my hand on there. And finally, I was running alongside him, and I didn't have my hand on it anymore. And he was going, and finally, I just stood there, and he went on down and almost made it to the bottom. And he fell off. And I thought, uh-oh, is this not going to work? No, he got up, but he was a little shaken, okay. But he was all excited. Oh, I did it. And so he took his bike up in a hurry. He wanted to try again.
Yeah.
And so it was interesting to watch because as he went down the next time, he did fall down again, but it was on that nice pasture that was down there at the when it was green and down at the old barn down below. And he just made it out in there, and he tried to make a turn, and that didn't work. But he did it right away.
What's your fondest memory of the farmhouse? Do you have a fondest memory of? It was a bit of a homestead, wasn't it? It was a homestead situation. It sure felt like that. It
was an old house. It was actually, it's in its historical records. It was an early house there, one of the earliest cabins in the area. Had been built out there about 300 yards, I believe it was, from there. The reason is there were springs there on the higher end of the hill, and you could build down below, and you would have had water flow. And then finally a little community kind of built up around that area. It's just north of Latah, and this little house became a stage stop. It wasn't a house, it was a little building there, and it became a stage stop. If you would step back in a certain location on the house, and you would step back a ways, and you look at the windows, the 4 sets of windows, it looks like an old movie house, one that you would look at and you say, that's an old building from a movie. And it had been a stage stop. It had been a school, a post office, and a schoolhouse. It was 2-story.
Yeah.
And it actually, on the other side of it, toward the barn that was up on the other little ridge there, a great big old barn, there was that side of the house up above. You look up there, and there was a piece of board there and a hole through the roof. And I got up and looked at that, and I said, I know what that is. That's a flag mount. Then all of a sudden, I realized what that mount was.
Yeah.
And I realized, then I went to one of the sheds because I said, I think the old flagpole is here. And I went down and I found this pole perfectly shaped, and there it went up. It slanted, and it was really neat. And I found that, and it was exactly, I took a measuring tape. I never went up and put it in. And I took a measuring tape, and it exactly would fit in those holes. And so you would have been able to drop it down there. Now, how they put it up and how they put a flag up, there was no hooks on the end of it, so there was probably some way that they had to do that. But it was kind of interesting. From that roof, if you were up on the top, I took a sight, or it's a little thing you sight with, has crosshairs in it, so that it's got a level in it, so you can tell when you're straight across looking at something. And I looked over to where our water spring was and where our water came from. And the spring was just a little higher than the top of that roof. Not a lot. Wasn't that awful far away, but it was high enough with a little container for the water. It wasn't very big, wasn't like hundreds of gallons. It might have been 30, maybe 20, not very much in there, and then out of one end, and it kind of let anything settle if any bad water come. And it would, we'd take and you could take a look, and it would, the water would flow down there. And it was good enough that you've seen these little sprinklers that look like a tractor with the long arms and they spin. It would take and run that thing and drag that hose across the lawn. It had that much power coming down just from that short distance.
Just as a free flow system.
Just as a free flow system.
Yeah.
In the old kitchen, hey, you came in the old kitchen and it had a wood stove over in the corner. We had got one and we put one in the corner. And it really fit the old house. The floor wasn't even. You got underneath, and I don't know that Jeffrey ever did it, but I know that that Lance crawled underneath our son. He crawled underneath and went around, and we were checking for holes between the concrete foundation they had put in years and years later. And this house was supported by big old trees that it was still, they'd carved off a little bit of one side, made it flat, and that's how it was supported. And it was just sitting on that.
Wow.
Yeah, it's just unbelievable, the stuff. But I lived in a house in Walla Walla that was the same way on Tusha Street. And if you went down, there was a partial basement. And if you went through one hole, you could get into the other section under the house. And you would see great big huge timbers. They were trees that they had just hewn off part of one side and set it, and then part of the sides on each end where it would be supported, and that's how it was supported. So
you grew up in Walla Walla then?
Grew up basically in Walla Walla. It was actually slapped into this world by Dr. Potts in Walla Walla, and quite a few years ago, in the General Hospital when it existed there in Walla Walla. And he slapped me into existence there.
Yeah. So how many years, when did you leave Walla Walla?
Let's see. We left Walla Walla and went to Fairfield when I was about, 17?
Okay.
And somewhere in there, 16, 17, later. And we arrived there. I was not doing real well, but anyway, they moved us there. And my mother went to work in Fairfield in the clinic as a person that met people at the desk and also worked on the books there because she was a bookkeeper.
Yeah.
And so she had been a bookkeeper in Crofts Flowers in Walla Walla for years and years. And because of the Sabbath issue, even though she was working from 6 to 6, and when she started, they had 13 accounts, and she did the books. When she left, they had over 8,000 accounts, and she was handling all the books. When they felt that she needed to come in on Saturdays too, and she said, "I won't do that." Anyway, they had to send out half the work and hire 2 full-time bookkeepers on top of it. So it was a big, good investment for them, they thought. Anyway, she had this opportunity, Dr. Potts' office. She was over there, to do something, and she walked in and she says, Bessie, I hear, that was my mother's name. She says, I hear you are not working there anymore. She says, you're out of a job. And she says, I know where there's a good job and you're just the person for it. And it was in Fairfield working for these doctors, and they were looking for somebody at that time. And so we drove up to take a look at it. Once they said, oh, yes, come up. So we drove up there. We didn't know how we were going to do it because Mom didn't have the money. And just a single mom with 2 kids, my sister and I. And so we drove up there. And we all said, no, we don't want to move here. Every tree in town, except in one place, there was no trees. There was no forest. We had huge pine trees there. All of them were dried up. There was a terrible drought going on, and even the needles, there wasn't a green tree, except one house had a green lawn and had green trees. And they said the reason is there's a spring in his backyard, and he's got enough water he can keep it up. But there was not enough water. For the community, there was enough water, but no lawns were allowed to be. Well, we didn't feel like we wanted to move there. It looked horrid. It looked horrid. But anyway, they actually moved us there physically. The people from the office and the church, they came down and moved us up there. It was a mission project started by Dr. Hart, and his brother, I believe, is president of Loma Linda today.
Oh, really? Okay. Do you remember the first job that you had?
The first job?
Yeah. Do we have any memory of the first job that you had?
Well, I had a lot of jobs, but actually, I think the first jobs I had were actually around the house. Of course, we had duties we had to do. My sister and I had to actually do the cleaning of the house, and we washed the dishes. There were no dishwashers except unless you owned a restaurant. And then there still was people, they had to load them and take them out, and they had to get all the stuff off them before they put them in. It was a lot more complicated. But we did all of that at the house. There was no allowance for that to begin with. But then Mom decided that we need to learn to keep books. So she decided we should get an allowance. So they decided to give us 25 cents a week. So that was our allowance. And we divided that up, paid our tithe, and a little bit of offering. We set that. We had to do a book. And it was a little tablet. Mom had set it all up, and we had to keep track of it. We had to keep track of our spending, what we were going to spend this on. It was going to be candy at the store or whatever. And, of course, you could buy a lot of candy for a couple cents. And
that's
pretty
been a
bad deal.
That's been a lifelong skill, hasn't it? Keeping books?
Yeah, well, it has kept me, I'm very glad that it had to do it, because it helped me when I got to business on my own. And first business on my own was doing lawns for people. And I just started doing that kind of thing, and it grew. People say, oh, Johnny, you're doing that lawn. Can you come over and do mine? And it happened in the neighborhood to begin with. And then it expanded because one big landscaping outfit wanted to hire me. And so I went to work for him, and I think the boss wanted to see what I would do if I was on my own. He didn't tell me what they were really up to. I can't remember the name of the place. They were quite well known in the community, and their family was well known. But anyway, they were a very large landscaping outfit. And so I worked there, and they left me on a job site one day, but they had told me what the plan was. They were landscaping a back lawn, and it was new, no lawn in yet. And they said, we're going to slope this off this way and slope this off this direction and all that kind of stuff. And that's got to go this way and that. And you're got to work on getting those rocks all picked up and piling them over there. So I was scooping up all the rocks and picking them up and getting them piled over. They hadn't showed up. So I got a rake out and I started dragging off the big humps and leveling areas. And I said, that doesn't look right. And so I started dragging that over like this and dragging that over but I had learned that already from people I had worked with. I had a good fortune of working with a man, and I can't remember which Scandinavian country, I think it was Denmark, that his boss was the queen, and he was the head rose gardener. And he'd done such a good job of doing roses. Therefore, she brought him in to not only to compliment him, but offer him, what would you like? I'd like to give you your wish. Now, that was very open-ended. And it isn't that he didn't like the queen. He did, and he liked his job. But he had one wish, and that could be that he could come to America. Well, he had to have a sponsor. And it just so happened Crofts Flowers, which I also worked for, out at their greenhouses and on their own lawns, they were the ones that became his sponsor. And so I learned some tricks that I'd never heard before, how to keep a lawn going when you have very little water, when to mow it, and when not to mow it, and he explained why. And once he did, it made sense, and then I started applying it everywhere else. I learned several things from him. It was very beneficial to me later. But back to the story level on this all out, I got it leveled out, and it was pretty good, and I kept looking at different angles, and I said, I'm not sure that I want it that way, so I won't move that yet. Anyway, they showed up, and they said, wow, picking up the rocks wouldn't have done this to this place. And, did you do this, Johnny? I was Johnny then. That's what happens when you're young. And I said, well, yeah, I thought you said you want this to roll down and so it'll be easy to mow. And he said, yeah. And he said, okay, how did you do that? I said, well, I used that particular rake over there, which I have one of those today. And I think you've seen it. It's a kind of a curved rake, and it's solid, but it has some little teeth at the bottom. And it's got one tooth broke off. It makes me a little nervous. You can drag gravel with it and that level, and yet if you push back the other way, it rides up on the stuff. And it's actually for cleaning out dead grass and stuff out of your lawn. And so you can rake it out, and we used to do that. I had to mow the lawn twice and rake it in between, and then rake it again afterward and collect all that and pile it next to the road, and it would be picked up by the garbage people every week. So that was one of my jobs that I had to do, and weed in the flower beds. And so...
So you worked your own job for a while.
Yep.
And then you got hired on by this company?
Well, that's what he was going to do. And he says, what I really want you for is we keep getting the calls by the people that just want us to mow a lawn. They don't want the fancy work. They just want somebody to mow a lawn. So we'd like to pass those calls to you. So I got those calls. And then they checked on me a couple times with the clients. I don't know that he ever drove by them, but he would check with the clients, is everything fine? And that's exactly what got me into doing more expensive jobs. And he reminded me that you're going to charge this amount, at least. And I had never charged those kind of fees at all. You could do a whole lawn for 50 cents. And now I was doing a whole lawn for $4, $3.75, $3.50, and that was a lot of money. Kids work around town, 75 cents, $1 was extreme. 50 cents, 70 cents was not unusual. And so I got to the point that I had so much work going on that other kids would say, well, look, can you give me some work? Well, I learned some lessons from the man from Denmark. He said the big thing is that things not only have to be good for the plant, but in making it good for the plant, it will be good for the people. They will like it because it'll be clean, it will be neat, it will not be confined, the plant will not be confined. And even in the forests here, trees are confined, they start dropping those branches, and they go higher and higher, and the green's up on top. And of course, we got a lot of dead, and that drops, but the trees that are near the edge of the forest, one side especially, has a heavy layer all the way down, or quite a ways down, of green branches coming out. No matter what kind it is, it's usually that way. And so I learned those things. So I would trim a certain amount of the house, no matter what, the walkway going in and up around their stepway. If they paid me for trimming, I trimmed everything because I did it with an old hand clipper, and I didn't use the modern ones they had that would that you could grab and squeeze up and down. The old hand clippers that I used were regular sheep shears. The reason is you could really sharpen them up like a razor. And let me tell you, did they cut quick and fast, and you didn't have all these foul-ups. By the time all these people were messing with the other snippers, I'd be done.
So you're on your knees with sheep shears crawling around trimming the grass.
Yeah. Well, hopefully I'd go fast enough that I could not be on my knees.
I see. Yeah.
But I let these kids go to work for me on one rule. I'll collect, and I'd have them go over and say, how much will you do the lawn for? And I said, now, I want you to make sure you do this extra little trimming because you're doing it for me. What I didn't really realize, all of these things are life training things for your future life. And one of the things I found is that if you're going to do this and you please them, then they're happy and you're happy because you get paid for it. And sometimes they give me a tip. You make it. They'd walk out the door and they said, I don't understand. Why when you mow our lawn, it looks so much better? We don't know why. They're just mowing the lawn. And I didn't tell them what it was, but I did do that little bit of trimming, and it kind of dressed it up. It's kind of like not going with your shirt all ruffled. Your shirt is nice and neat. And then people think you're nice and neat. It's the same thing.
So you've got other kids working for you in the neighborhood?
Yes, and so when they did, I'd say, okay, now you'll get paid after I come and look it over. Otherwise, you don't get paid at all. I learned those lessons. I had to deal with that myself. And so because of some of the hardships you get, we didn't have money, and I was thankful. Although as a kid, I knew a boy down the street. His father was a dentist, and he wasn't just a dentist. He had a big clinic. And this kid had anything he desired. And he was always touting it to us kids around the neighborhood. So when my brother Jim would build us stilts, and my sister Kathy, he built wood stilts for us, which got us about 2 feet off the ground. He had some that went about 8 feet off the ground. And we envied that. He way up in the air. He really got a kick. He had to get on the roof to get on him. But Kathy, my little sister, she had stilts too. And he came up with the idea she needs stilts too, but she needs one she can not fall over with. So he took the big 64 ounce, I think they are, they're big juice cans, huge juice cans, and took the openers we had then that you bent them over and they would cut a V slot in them. And then he run a wire through it, then pull a string through it. It was heavy, wouldn't get cut easily, and then have it so that she could grab that wire in a loop and walk along and keep the cans on her feet. And she could walk with her hands and walk on the cans. And that was still, after all, they were, maybe 10 inches above the ground for her. That was really something, when you're not very old. So he did that. Well, the little rich kid, we call him, he was a nice boy. But he was always touting his all that, I have this. You guys can't do this, But, I don't blame him for it. It's just the way he grew up. And he'd come down and say, my dad said he'll pay you if you make him a pair of stilts. He said, well, you can buy the board. And he would take a 2x4, split it in half, and then make stilts out of them. And we had a little shop downstairs, and you could, run it through the table saw and do that. So all the kids in that neighborhood had stilts, and they did that.
And your brother was making them for them?
He was making them for them.
Would they pay him?
Yeah, well,
some of them.
Sometimes the parents would give him a little for doing it, but they'd pay for the material to do it.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of neat, but we didn't stop at that. I never ran around with my cousins and stuff, but I never had a lot of close friends in the neighborhood, one or two, but there were some older boys came in the area. Oh, I almost thought of their name. But anyway, they were quite a bit older than I was, and they said, oh, you want to have a really fun thing to ride? He said, we ride trikes too. Now, these were teenagers in high school, and they said they ride trikes. And I thought, what are you guys riding trikes for? Oh, we'll show you. So they showed us a trike. And today you buy them like this, but he took the front wheels off, the front wheel of it, and then ran it through the bike the other direction. You flipped it over, so instead of the curvature of where the seat was going up, it went down. And you've seen these where they, and you're sitting down on it. Well, there was no seats. So we'd get a burlap bag. By the way, a lot of people don't know what a burlap bag is, but we got potatoes and all kinds of stuff in it. But it's very heavy corded type of material it's made out of, quite strong. And we'd fold them up, sometimes a couple of them, matter how much padding we had of our own, and us kids were pretty skinny. And so we'd fold them up, and you'd sit down in there, and we'd race around there like we had motorcycles, And these kids had big ones that they'd done the same thing with. Well, wasn't long. Other kids in the neighborhood said, can you do that to our trike? And we'd say, well, not without your parents' permission. So we did all those little fun things growing up. You made things out of what you had. And it was a lot of fun growing up and doing those. Oh, got to tell you one other thing. One thing I really liked, we had a little Chihuahua. Its name was Tiny. Tiny was tiny. And she had almost died. I didn't know her at that time, but she had almost died. She was old when I was young. And a great big dog had come out and literally bit out a big chunk right out of her stomach area. And she was bleeding really bad, and she would have died within maybe a minute or so or more. And my mother grabbed the dog's stomach, held it as tight as she could in that area, grabbed that skin, held it together with one hand. They rushed to the vet. The vet saved her, sewed her up, and she lived. But after that, she had one of the most ferocious appetites you could believe. And we fed her Friskies, canned dog food. It was the hot thing on the television at the time. Those, not like the TVs today. Very big box. Very big box. And we actually were one of the first people that had a color television, but we brought it from California, and then there was no color television there. It was I can't remember the name of the station right now, but it came out of Tri-Cities, and that's the only thing you could get. Anyway, so we sold it. We sold it back to Sears, where we had got it, and actually was able to trade it for a black and white. I think we didn't pay much difference. And it wasn't that old. It was maybe a few months as we'd moved back from California. And so anyway, we would watch and do that stuff. And now I lost where I was going with it, started with this story.
The color TV.
Trading in for the black and white.
Oh, yeah. Well, we traded it in for black and white and that kind of thing. But, and of course, we got quite a few people that would come over to watch.
The dog?
The dog. That was it.
Tiny.
Yeah. Tiny. And so Tiny, she had, because of watching, that's how I got off when I was watching TV, we fed her Friskies in the canned dog food. Okay. So she was only supposed to get about a quarter of that a day. And somebody would feed her in the morning. And then somebody else would come home and she'd whine and whine and whine, just like she had never been fed. And she was just starving, standing at the refrigerator, going back and forth, and, so they'd feel sad and didn't want her to starve to death. So they'd feed her. And then it would happen again. Somebody else, and they'd feed her. Well, one day it happened like that, and she went through that process, and we looked all over the house. We couldn't find her anywhere. Anyway, we were sitting in the front room, and we heard, and we said, what is that? But she had a bed behind the oil stove in the front room. That's how the house was heated. And went over to look. There was Tiny laying on her back with her feet up in the air. And she looked like a stuffed pig. She just was tight as a drum. Mom picked her up. And she was tight, literally. You would think her skin would bust. It was so tight, we all had to feel it. It was so tight. Anyway, she did live through it. We didn't know what to do. Didn't know whether we should give her an enema and make her try to barf by sticking her finger down, but she might have bit us down her throat. Anyway, I don't remember all of what they did to her, but anyway, she did survive. But she had that habit of trying to trick us. After that big incident that she did that, we kind of tried to remember. Wait until everybody was back together before we fed her. She would not die. But we had a sympathy issue.
Yeah.
Now, this taught another one of those life things. If we don't learn that we have to go on. If we don't learn, we have to go on. We can, or stand up. It can be a real issue. It could be harmful for the dog, but our sympathies got so wrapped up in it. I see stuff going on today, And it bothered me. I said, where's people's thinking? Did they never learn any life issues?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Sympathy is... So we're maybe a little too sympathetic? Is that a word?
Well, I think we could have sympathy, but how do we apply it?
Yeah.
And I believe that's it, because I should maybe have sympathy for myself even at some times in the right way, but I cannot let that control real life. Because I was responsible for those jobs, and I had learned that being responsible for them, it meant that I needed to be responsible. And I would show up. I made sure I showed up. I made sure the job. I was kind of like, I was envied the postmaster. The postman we had. He had never been sick a day in his life. He wore short pants, came to about his knees, all summer and half the winter. He walked really briskly all the time, and everybody knew exactly when they were getting their mail. He was never more than 10 minutes off. It was really something else. And when the day came, he didn't show up. He didn't show up. Our mail didn't show up. And it didn't show up and didn't show up. And we usually got ours about the middle part of the day. And finally, a mailman showed up, which was not him. And we said, where's the mailman? And why is our mail so late? The reason it's so late is I'm having to tell everybody what's going on. And we understood. He said, this man has never been sick a day in his life, never missed a day at work. When he met the criteria, come rain or snow, the mail must go through. Now I'm not sure what it is today, but I'm not sure that it hasn't come back to some of this responsibility issue. But there were probably days he didn't feel as well as others, but he always showed up. Oh, by the way, he had appendicitis. He was having his appendix taken out.
So he didn't die.
So, those kind of things so inspired me.
Yeah.
He inspired me. I liked how people thought about him. And I said, yeah, that's good. What's wrong with having people think well of you? But also you need to be aware if everybody thinks to think well of you. Are you thinking properly? Are you carrying on? Are you willing to stand up for what needs to be taken care of? And I remember our neighbor lady, he was a retired railroad guy. He had lived right behind us. Great people. They invited us, cute kids, before we had a television, to go over to their house and watch Wagon Train, I think it was, and 2 or 3 other programs. Mom said, okay, you can go over there. So we go over there. Watch with this old couple, especially the lady. Oh, and she thought Superman was real. She thought for sure he was going to stop at her house one day. So it was kind of a little disconnected there in spots. They were neat people. He was making, I got to finally see it. He was making a perpetual motion machine. He was a person that worked with metal a lot when he worked on the railroad. And so he was making that. I knew he was working out there all the time, and his shop was right on his back porch. He had a big building out back, but he didn't do that. Matter of fact, us kids got to use the big building, and he says, you kids need to build you something right up on our roof. I said, well, we don't want to take a lot. Oh, no, you don't have to. Just go through the door, and there's a there's a stairway. Just go up that stairway, and it's open the door. You'll be on the roof. So we ended up doing that. We actually built a little fort up there, and it was kind of neat. It was right on the corner, almost the corner of our place and his place. But anyway, we go over there. Every time we go over, we finally had to build a little ramp because the dog would whine and whine and whine at the door. And Grandma would say she lived with us for a while. That was the neatest experience of my life. I learned a lot from her. Anyway, she got tired of it every time we were over there. And the lady just loved Tiny, and Tiny would come up and jump on our laps and stay there all the time and watch television. Crazy dog, little tiny dog, sit there and watch the television. So we finally came up with a solution. And our bedroom window, we always left open. And she tried to jump out of there one time, but it was too far down, and she got hurt. So we just put a little ramp on it, and she'd jump up on the window and run down the ramp, and next thing we knew, she'd scratch on their door. And so she'd go to the door, and the little lady was just tickled to death. And then Tiny would come in and jump on our laps. Every Sunday is when that happened. It was really kind of cute. I mowed their lawn. And it was a tough lawn because we had a wall around our place because our houses were higher there. The land was higher than the sidewalk. Then we had what they call a parking area. It's not where they park. It's just a section between that had grass. Now, one of the areas had a string of black walnut trees there. And the black walnut trees, if you know anything about black walnuts, they have a very big skin on the walnut. And it's really messy stuff to step on, and it really can stain things in a hurry. And that has to come off if you're going to get at the walnut. And then you have a terrible time. You need almost a hammer and an anvil to crush those things. You do not use just a hand tool. They are too hard. But anyway, their lawn did not have a wall around it. It just sloped right down to and it was a very steep slope. And I had a power mower, and I was the power. And it was a push mower, similar to the little push mower I've got over here, but it was not as narrow as that, and it was not the quality of that. Ours was called a Chieftain, and they were known as the best lawnmower. They moved easier than the others, and they really cut well. I would have to drag that up the hill, get it just right, and then let it go down the hill, and it would cut on the way down. Then I'd have to drag it up the hill and do it down. Of course, I wasn't very big. I was the smallest kid in class. There was another John, and he was from Melton Freewater, and he was the smallest kid in the class also. We were about the same height, so we got teased a lot. Because of that, we became a little bit friendly toward one another because we were both receiving the same results. But life, I like it because of the fact they didn't have all the big rules. I would go out, I could start a business as a kid, and I think that's important. If you made a mistake on a customer's place and they thought you did, your mother heard about it, and you heard about it. Your mom or dad heard about it, and it made a big difference. And it's not like, oh, we got punishment. But you know what? I believe the scripture. I know that it's kind of hard for people to swallow it. I think you can be cruel about it. But I remember the last spanking I got. It was after I sassed my grandmother, and I was 14 years old. Little smart Mm-hmm. You're right. Anyway, I sassed her, and Grandma just calmly said, "I will be mentioning this to your mother." And that was it. I knew what that meant. I hadn't had seen a strap for a long time, which is a belt doubled over. And I never died, but I learned, and it was good for me. You know, she got home. She was a little woman like my grandmother. And she said, "Now you can outrun me. You could probably take this strap away from me if you wanted to. But," she says, "it'll still be here when you get home." So, it's your decision when. So she allowed me to make the choice. I decided it was time to bend over the bed and take what I had coming. She gave it to me. No, I didn't cry. I was the tough kid, then. But you know something? I'm glad it happened because of the fact it taught me that respect is important, and the police do have a right to enforce the laws. That's their job. And it was the beginning of me finding out what's the difference between a country that's run by rules and a country that is not. Because I knew a home that it wasn't like that. I would not have wanted to grow up like that boy did that I knew. And I would not have wanted the results that came later in his life. And I would not have, he was involved in an accident at the school, at the church that I went to. A bunch of us went to the mountains together with the Pathfinder leader. And he was in there, but he was always stirring up trouble. But there was somebody that always stood behind him it was okay to stand up for trouble. And it was his parents, especially his mother. I feel sorry for her too, because that meant she probably was that way and she didn't know what else to do. You begin to look with that sympathy differently. In other words, just because somebody makes a wrong action, it doesn't make you non-sympathetic to them as an individual. After all, how did they grow up? But because of it, the pickup that we were in, and a lot of us were in the back of it, flipped over, and several of us got hurt. One guy that was in the cab, his leg went through the windshield, was cut to the bone. Another one, a big, tall guy, he kept fainting all the time. And then they thought they'd got everybody out from underneath the truck. One guy, it was one of them, he jumped when it was going over, so he just landed on his feet and walked away from it. And a lot of them, got out of it okay. And then they were all around. They had went to look for a vehicle up the road, because we were way up in the mountains. They had passed a farmhouse, so they were headed there for help. No cell phones, of course. And they were headed there for help. And then after a bit, I woke up. I could still feel the rocking, and I then realized I needed to pull my arm out from underneath the cab, which could have been just as well my head. I feel God had blessed and kept us, probably basically for the sake of all of us, to learn lessons. And also the driver, to show God's grace and mercy to him. He had a very unusual story. You could read about him and his brother in the book called The Sleigh Boss Story. He almost killed him. And it wasn't that they weren't trying. Anyway, it's a very interesting story, but here he had become a Christian, and because of a lot of situations. Anyway, it's a story you all want to read.
And what's the name of the story again?
The Slaybaugh Story. And don't ask me the spelling. I'm not a speller. But, you know, they got a vehicle, and then I came crawling out while a lot of them were gone. I came crawling out, and they said, hey, somebody else is under there. They didn't realize they hadn't taken count because some of them had left right away. So a lot of them didn't even recognize who was what and who was out. Nobody really counted heads. Well, I crawled out. They got me over, and my arm was giving me a lot of pain. I had what they call a car coat. It's a very, very heavy coat. I had 2 sweatshirts on, or 2 heavy bulk. They call them bulky knit sweaters. They're very bulky in knit. It's a very large knit. I had 2 of those on and a shirt. It was very cold. And anyway, they got me over and said I had to hold on to my arm. It really hurt if I didn't hold on to it and keep it bent. And so I did that. And then they drove up in a vehicle. Meantime, the boys had pushed the truck, the pickup, been able to push it on its upside down to the side enough that it turn it and push it a little bit where a vehicle could get by it. They knew if they were coming from up, that's what would happen. And anyway, they literally took the truck. If the man hadn't left the key in it, it wouldn't have been as easy. One of the men said, the older guys, he said, we can hotwire it. I've done that on my grandpa's truck, so we know how to do it. But it had a key in it, so they just took it, and they said, if some people come by, just tell them we've taken the truck. And they were tickled they did it when they found it. But we were a long ways out. They had to drive, and they came into Dayton. It was Sunday. And, of course, the doctor's office wasn't open. But we found it. It was right on Main Street. And because somebody knew where it was. They said, oh, just right there. So they went up and they found a phone number in case of emergency. And so they went and made a phone call, but there was an address, and they went right over to it. And they went in, and he had people there and everything, and he told them the situation. We need to have you look at the boys. Oh, no, I'm not going to look at them. You just take them on into Walla Walla, which was several miles. Well, he didn't know. There was something happened to the big guy, and he kept passing out. So we didn't know if something really bad was on him. I was in the back. The one fellow that jammed his leg through the window, he was trying to help keep the other guy from passing out. We didn't know it was something to do with his arm or something, but we didn't know if something else was wrong. It was scaring the guy. And so he wanted this doctor to see him, at least check him over. And he said, no, just go on in. And then the man looked at him, the guy that was our Pathfinder leader. He said, I already went to prison. I was in for trying to kill a man. And that murder's liable to happen today if you don't go to the office. I am threatening you. And so he went to the office, and of course nothing was ever said about it because of the fact that that wasn't right, that he wouldn't do that. He had taken an oath to do that. And he went to the office. He said, no, I'm pretty sure everything's okay. It was very nice after that. I understand he didn't want to leave his company. He wasn't down there, maybe it took 40 minutes of his time. So we raced all the way to the hospital. And, the man went through a few lights. You know what? You can't find a cop when you need one. We went to the whole town. We got all the way there to the hospital without getting stopped at all. And they found out that the boy that kept passing out had a broken finger. The other guy that was cut to the other they took him in. Mine, they x-rayed several times, and they said, your arm's just one huge, arm's been crushed, and your arm is one huge, huge blood blister from about your, almost to your wrist to almost to your shoulder. And they put me into a sling. We all survived. Of course, the young man was scared to death because he was on probation. But, it all got worked out. But you know who was upset? Remember the boy? The boy that jumped out of the truck? That actually created the problem that caused the truck to cause the driver to be distracted, and he made a turn a little too quick, and it was slick needles. It was winter, fall.
Yeah.
Damp road. You know what that's like. We live up here where that can be slick. And it flipped it. But that was the people that complained. And, of course, the church people said, hey, back it down.
Yeah.
The rest of us weren't. But, there's a lot of adventures, but as I look back in them, I'm glad for the times of trial. And I'm glad for the people that I met. And I'm glad for those things because I learned a lot of things that was helpful for me as I met, because I didn't know my father, that I finally met the man that was my mentor in my life that helped me grow spiritually, to grasp, and then all these things begin to fit together. They made sense. They begin to fit together. And I have to say, they hadn't fit together as well as they are now, because as things I've learned more. But the Bible says more and more to the perfect day. That's our path we're on. And he's able to get us there. That's what he's promised. And as a kid growing up, I wanted salvation. I wanted things to happen in my life. And I would go up for altar call after altar call. That's what I wanted. But I couldn't seem to perform like I thought I needed to. But I didn't understand. And now that I've become, what freedom. Once you begin to understand and wake up and what God can do. But I look back and all the times I could have been killed. Going down the road 150 miles and 120 miles an hour in cars that would do those things and do it for hours. Why didn't we get killed? I look around and I see and I say there has to be something. I know a friend of mine and I'm jumping ahead a lot in years, but a friend of mine and I did a lot of running around together. And I knew there had two praying mothers had to be for me and him. Both single moms. And we haven't actually been the best kids in the world. And a conversation started one day that sent us apart. And I look back and I realized it was probably the good for both of us. And one said person, I don't know who started and which started the conversation, but I once said, I'm tired. And the other one said, I know what type tired it means. You mean. And the other one said, and you know what that means? The other one said, yeah, we can never see each other again. I walked out of his room. He was playing the guitar when all this took place. I seen him once on the other side of the road and waved at him. Oh, we had already planned what we were going to say to the kids because they all wanted us to get together for parties. And other people, too, that got together. And it didn't mean that we weren't friends at all, but something had separated us. And I believe it was time. It wasn't too long after that I ended up moving to that dry town that I started this story with, where we moved to Fairfield. And we got there in that dry town. And that's the only time I ever seen that town that dry. And that's a good sign. And now there's a lot of stories in life, but you know, if you learn from the things as you go along, which you guys have, it's very important. It doesn't mean that we don't make terrible, terrible mistakes. There's a lot of mistakes I've made that I would never talk about. And I thank God he says he buries them and they'll never be brought up. Oh, wow. What a guy. They can do that. I know I've sat with cousins and we've said, yeah, there's things we're just not going to ever talk about. And, you know, it wasn't like we were super bad kids or something when you compare it with around about you. Or you even look today, it's getting worse in a lot of ways. But a lot of it's just what's going on. I mean, how many of us have learned the little life things along the road or had any mentor at all?
Yeah.
And if you have these little mentors in your life, the main mentor that come in, but I've seen a lot. I thought, one teacher I had in school, I couldn't understand. He wrote many of our textbooks, Bible textbooks, for schools all over the world. And yet I watched him go up in tears on an altar call on a week of prayer. And it was confusing to me. I thought it was wonderful because, you know, I looked at it and I look back now from years ago being so involved with homeschool in the Northwest and how the Lord led in those things to bring us together as the people I was with. But the learning process we all go through. And that's why you can't judge another person. You can see a person make stupid blunders and say, hey, not here, you know. And it's just like downtown here. I'm thankful that they had some guys said, that's not here. No bricks and rocks through our windows. That's why we're packing these fire sticks. And I'm thankful for people that stand up and carry out their rights. You know, God gives rights, and he knows that we have the right. I've just been reading very interesting little thing here. And the interesting thing of watching in the book there, he's describing the thing that happened with you know, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they said, hey, look, we're not bowing down to this idol. But that very king was so thrilled to have these guys in the positions they were, because they were trustworthy. They understood a lot of logical things, and they ran his government well, and he was the leader of the world government at that time. But he had a selfish streak, and it's either my way or the fiery furnace. And anyway, I appreciate Wayne and his wife writing the book, and I can't wait until it's out, been published. And we just got started reading, and it's exciting. But a lot of things are like that in life. My mentor gave me a book one day, and it began to open my eyes to understanding of lifestyle. And then later years, and I'll have to tell that story one of these times, later years, if it hadn't been for him and those that he had and how I was treated when I got scarlet fever, if it hadn't been for that, I would never have raised my daughter or son. Never been able to. Just a short period, I would have died of the scarlet fever. And to have one of the top specialists in the disease sitting there Didn't know me from Adam, only knowing me from the special hospital that I was in and what was going on, testing me to try to find out what was wrong. And he's the one that stood there and said, whatever you're doing, don't change it. You should be getting worse or you're not. We don't know why. And when I told him how I was treated, I said, well, I won't tell you who, but I will tell you how. He said, all I got to say is that man saved your life. If we would have got you in the hospital and given you one shot of antibiotic, we would have said you died from scarlet fever, and it would not have been true at all. You just couldn't stand, your body could not stand the extra toxin, and it would have killed you instantly, just within a few hours.
Wow.
So, you look back and you say, why me? Why me? But I look across the table and see two grandsons, and I say, they wouldn't have been here either. And so, I look at life is more than we sometimes look too short.
Mm-hmm.
And a sympathy thing, I think we sometimes look too short. We're looking, at a self. I think that's why Lucifer, the light bearer, had the most powerful position in heaven next to God himself, next to his throne. And yet, he wanted the sympathy of the angels. And so he became not a light bearer, but Satan. And like the Bible says, he's come to kill, steal, and destroy. And killing and stealing and destroying is always not readily seen. You take a look at our society, they could be the sweetest person in the world, and they could be a huge mass murderer. After all, take a look at some of the people, the Hitlers, people that were like him. And you see, hey, how did he get in office? He was voted into office. How did he get there? Sweet, nice. Oh, yeah, he even gave money to people. Help them out of their financial situations.
Yeah.
I look at it and I say, those are the things that help me begin to understand, because it's pretty hard to understand what God's trying to say to us.
Yeah.
It's confusing. I've tried to do this. I've tried to be good. I'm not being counted. He said, well, I sure wish you could try to do what you're trying to do. Have you read the scripture and seen what it had to say on that point? And Jesus had a terrible time. He had to talk about even Sabbath keeping to the Jews. And they wanted to hang him over it. And forgiveness. And the man didn't care if he was healed. He just that had been let down through the ceiling. He was nice to know. I can just see, hey, sometimes we have so much burden that we're carrying, just to know it's forgiven. And I know my brother. Tell this little story. I'm going to tell you why. Not a lot of my life was the best. And I had long forgiven him. But on his deathbed, when I had to fly to California, and he didn't figure he was going to make it, there was a big bunch of people in the room, so there was no discussion going to take place. But he was tickled I was there. I went over to him, and first things out of his mouth, well, he said, first of all, good to see you. It's hard for him to breathe. And couldn't give up his cigarettes. And even though he already had disease with his lungs, he couldn't give it up. Anyway, he looked at me real seriously and he says, "Is everything okay?" And I knew what he was asking. "Will you forgive me?" And I said, "Everything is absolutely fine." He didn't know I, through God's help, had dealt with those things. He just fell back in that bed, and I watched him relax. The rest of them in the room didn't know. There were a bunch of people there. But when my cousin's wife was taking me home, day after, separate, another cousin taking me first to where I was staying, had an aunt's. Anyway, she asked me several questions about the family. She wanted to know. And I said, "Yeah." She says, "Well, I've never really believed all the stories I heard, because there's a lot of things just want to get covered up." She says, "But I noticed Jimmy, when you talked to him, all of a sudden he fell back in his bed. He was all up anxious as much as he could, trying to hear me." And she said, "I don't know what was going on between the two of you, but all of a sudden I just seen he was totally relieved." I said, "Yes, he was. But I had been relieved of it a long time before. And he'd carried a terrible, terrible burden." So a lot of times we make terrible, terrible mistakes. And it affects our life all our life. But I look at it and I say, when you look back and you look at some of these things, and maybe some of these stories will help somebody. But when we look at these things, there's something watching over us. And I'm glad to know today that it's God, that He's all-powerful. And I'm quite willing that if I should die, it doesn't bother me, because I know He's going to take care of you guys. He's going to take care of Grandma. I don't have to worry about it. He'll even take me care of the things I hit that cause my problems. But I believe that there are many people that will be able to tell stories like that. I know Mike Paul, he's going to have many of them. He's a great storyteller in the first place. But anyway.
Well,
I know you have to get going.
You tell stories quite well yourself, Grandpa.
No.
Well, yeah, I do have to get going. And I think that's probably a good stopping place right now.
Yeah.
I do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, you're more than welcome.
We've been talking about doing this, and
well, it's once I get going, then all kinds of things pop in my mind.
Right.
And it goes all over the place. And, I think that's true of all of us.
Yeah.
But I have to tell you this one last thing. I have tried to encourage even Lance when he was young. I would say I learned a lot from older people. I would seek them out. There would be a potluck or something going on, and there'd be some old person sitting over there, just vegetating, and I'd go over. And maybe their language wasn't perfect, as far as maybe their minds weren't perfect. And I'd say, "Hey, tell me about your life." They'd have a hard time. I'd say, "What do you mean?" They'd say, "What do you mean by that?" And so I'd say, "Well, did you grow up?" I'd give it for instance or something. "Oh, no, I didn't." And once they got started, they'd open up, and I learned so much wisdom, because I'd find out where they made mistakes. And I'd say, "Yeah, I've been having that same issue." I'd think to myself, and it just really is an eye-opener. And Lance would go with my grandmother and go and sit down with her and do that same thing, because I had talked him into it. Now, how we apply that and what we do with it, that's a big issue. If you don't learn from it, what good is it? It was just a waste of time. Maybe you enjoyed the time because it was interesting at the moment. But if you learn from it, you say, well, and maybe you don't learn anything about it today, but you might think, oh, yeah, oh, yeah, somebody told me, oh, yeah, they did this. In other words, how do you handle some things? Of course, I always love to find out things, too, and find out how they worked. And Grandma helped me there because I was always trying to make something or fix something. And one day she came in and she said, my clock quit working. Fix it. I said, Grandma, I can't fix it. She's just take it apart and fix it. I said, I'll probably ruin it. She said, it's ruined now. So what? Just go ahead and do it. And I said, Grandma, I just don't want to do that. We didn't want to break anything in Grandma's because that was something we cherished ourselves. And finally, she talked me into it. So I did. Believe it or not, actually, all I needed to do was clean things up and put it all back together. I had a little trouble figuring that out, but it went back together and it ran. And you know what that did for me? Why not try? See, I would not have carried on. Why not try? If they say something, well, it's broke. We can't do anything. We'll have to buy a new one. Well, can we fix it? After all, some idiot made it. And maybe they just discovered that along the way.
Well, Grandpa, you've given us so much advice over the years. I catch myself even now telling Lexi, I need to run that by Grandpa. I've been thinking about this, and I need to run this by Grandpa. I need to run it by another head, and Grandpa's the one to run it by. So, as you know,
oh yeah, but that's okay.
I'm always coming to you with looking for advice for one thing or another because I know that you have sage advice, and I know that you have had the experience, and through those experiences we can learn, right?
Well, I think it's possible. The biggest thing is we can cause our own damage by not picking up, and that's what I did learn. Yeah, very strongly that, hey, why not ask a question? I've asked a question a dozen times, and you learn that by even trying to buy something. And you say, well, should I get this or this? I don't know enough about it to get it. And what do? You try to look up on the reviews. But sometimes you get real questions about the reviews. It's almost like, are these guys in it together, right. Type of deal. Yeah. Yet at the same time, when you get that feeling, it's amazing if you wait, have patience, and then do a different type of look or talk to somebody and they'll say, well, why don't you look up on this? And you say, oh, yeah. And you go look up on it and, you got all kinds of things about it. And you just say, wow, why didn't I think of that? Well, that I just learned from somebody else again. And it's an ongoing thing. Can you imagine? To have a being that is so tickled about what he can do. Just like I told Jeffrey years ago, I can remember telling him, I said, you don't know what you could do. And I said, you never know when God might be sitting up there and say, you know what? They're working so hard on trying to come up with an answer for it. I think I'm going to give them the answer nobody in the whole world has ever thought about. And so that little thing comes, and then they can work on it and see how to put it together. The reason I say that is because I have seen that happen in my own experience. And then all of a sudden you say, where did I ever get that to begin with? To get me to change my direction and go that way. And let me tell you, I've had that happen, and I was not following God.
God
But
can.
he was there doing that, showing me, look, I'm in control, and I can show you, you can grab on and expect something from me.
God can choose us to be something so much more than we ever could be.
Oh, yeah.
And he can choose to show you specifically, or me, or Jeffrey.
Well, you take a look at, and we got the stories. You take a look at, at any of these individuals, whether it was a man that his brothers hated him, and so they sold him, and he ends up through a big mess. But he decided, I'm not gonna look at it that way. I'm going to be honest and play the game right and stay with it. And I believe God's got control. And then he ends up, that gets messed up on, cheated on him, and he ends up in prison. And then he ends up, guess what? Ruler in the world. And so I look at those, and there's a lot of those you can look at, and I say, that's nothing unusual.
Yeah.
And you're going to find people you meet, and that's the way you're going to find them.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
Well, all I know is people pay for life coaches, and we haven't paid you a dime, so we're getting out nicely.
Oh, yeah. Well.
Thank you.
Anyway, the Lord bless you.
Thank you. Yeah.